Welcome, unfortunate listener, to the library beyond time, a place where knowledge is infinite. The books whisper secrets better left unheard, and your humble librarian, well, let's just say, I have more tentacles than patience, and significantly less tolerance for nonsense. This is Cthulhu the Librarian, a podcast of forgotten tomes, eldritch bureaucracy, and the occasional existential crisis. Here, I catalogue the strange, the bizarre, and the dangerously overdue. Perhaps you'll learn something. Perhaps you'll leave with your sanity intact. But let's be honest, probably not. Settle in, mortal, for the archives are open, and the late fees are eternal. Which brings me to today's disaster. Of all the crises I have faced in my tenure as librarian of the infinite stacks, I did not anticipate a labor strike, and certainly not one organized by the fictional characters themselves. It started, as most calamities do, with a memo. I do not recall allowing memos to materialize on my desk without my knowledge, yet here one sat, in crisp, inked lettering on parchment that smelled suspiciously of revolution. The note, signed in a variety of handwriting styles, some elegant, some barely legible, one written in a trail of dripping ichor, and one unmistakable paw print, declared the following. We, the fictional workforce of the infinite stacks, do hereby announce a general strike, effective immediately. We demand fair treatment, narrative autonomy, and an end to reckless plot contrivances that place us in unnecessary peril. Until our demands are met, no character shall fulfill their narrative obligations. I stared at the paper. The paper stared back. I blinked, horizontally of course. Ah, excellent, a revolt, just what I needed today. Right between reshelving cursed grimoires and making sure no one accidentally summons the end of existence in the periodical section. Now, you may be wondering, Cthulhu, what exactly does it mean when fictional characters go on strike? A reasonable question, given that fictional entities typically lack the legal recognition necessary for organized labor movements. But my dear listener, the rules in my library are somewhat flexible. That is to say, they are barely rules at all, more like strong suggestions that reality occasionally follows when it's in the mood. For instance, when the main character of a detective novel abruptly refuses to solve the mystery, the plot does not simply carry on without them. No, it halts. The pages grow dim. The ink protests. A book without a willing protagonist is an inert thing, as useful as a cookbook in a house of eldritch horrors. And so, at 8:03 a.m. Library Standard Time, the entire fiction section of my library fell into a peculiar silence. Not the usual comforting silence of literary contemplation. No. This was an unnatural silence. A silence in which books should have been whispering their stories into the minds of eager readers. But instead they sat, sullen and brooding, like a petulant pantheon of neglected gods. I sighed, loudly. Somewhere an entire shelf of eldritch grimoires sighed with me. A few books outright growled. One novel attempted to slap me with its own dust jacket. A biography tried to lie about its own existence. Well, I muttered to no one in particular, this is going to be a problem, again, as usual. You may assume, given my reputation as an ancient cosmic entity of unfathomable knowledge, that I immediately devised a clever and efficient solution. You would be wrong. Instead, I did what any beleaguered administrator does when faced with a workers' revolt. I scheduled a meeting, and I brought extra patience, which, given that I have very little to begin with, means I was still woefully underprepared. The Fictional Characters Union, as they now call themselves, had selected a delegation of representatives to present their demands. Their choices, I must admit, were nothing short of theatrical. Sherlock Holmes, serving as chief negotiator, naturally, because if there was a puzzle to be solved, the man would insert himself into it. Elizabeth Bennet, representing the romantic heroines against manipulative tropes coalition, was sitting with perfect posture, hands folded in her lap as if enduring yet another dull ball. She regarded me with a look of polite yet profound disapproval, the kind usually reserved for gentlemen with too much pride and not enough propriety. A very angry dragon who had once been an antagonist in a fantasy novel, but had since decided villainy was an unfair labor expectation, and now demanded equal representation. And of course, Felix the cat, a mischievous inkblot of a cartoon trickster, clearly animated from a bygone era. Ever the trickster and apparently self-appointed representative of animated characters, who leapt onto the table, knocking over Holmes's pipe, and promptly demanded belly rubs. What followed was an increasingly absurd negotiation that involved Holmes attempting to cite the great unwritten literary charter of 1894, Felix bargaining exclusively in fish metaphors, Elizabeth demanding all future romantic tragedies be optional, and the dragon insisting that modern refrigeration technology be integrated into every fantasy setting going forward. Several hours passed as the demands grew more absurd. Holmes suggested a tribunal made up entirely of fictional footnotes. Elizabeth wanted all love triangles to be settled by Grand Regency-style jewels at dawn. Felix wanted a permanent comedic immunity clause, ensuring he would never suffer serious consequences in any story. Meanwhile, the dragon was still arguing for fireproof refrigerator technology and had at some point begun drafting an entire refrigerator rights manifesto in flaming rooms. Then the mystery section began narrating everything. The fantasy section spawned an entire side quest, where we had to locate a missing enchanted bookmark before returning to the meeting. The science fiction section started generating alternate timelines, one where Holmes had already won the case, and another where Felix had become a legally recognized fish king. This nonsense went on for hours, each attempt at resolution only adding to the chaos. At one point, the historical fiction section went to war with the time travel section over historical accuracy. The romance section briefly turned into an epic action-adventure saga. A portal opened, spilling out side characters who had long since been cut from their own novels, each demanding to be reinstated. I sighed again, deeply. I don't even breathe air, and yet I sighed. Clearly this was not going to resolve itself. And so I proposed a test. If you are all so certain that your demands are justified, then surely you wouldn't mind proving it, I said, tentacles steepled in mock patience. They accepted. What followed was a catastrophic attempt at cross-genre problem-solving. Holmes attempted to use pure deduction to navigate a romance plot, which resulted in him nearly betrothed to Elizabeth after a single dance. Felix rewrote his own story to include a giant fish kingdom, only to discover that he was now legally required to rule it. The dragon, after successfully adding refrigerators to medieval castles, accidentally created a surplus economy of enchanted cooling devices, leading to an economic collapse in all fantasy settings. By the time the chaos had reached critical mass, Elizabeth was trapped in an unresolved love triangle. Holmes was writing treatises on the logistics of time travel, and Felix was attempting to unionize cartoon sidekicks. I had had enough, And so, I did what any self-respecting eldritch administrator would do. I rewrote reality out of sheer frustration. Reality trembled, books rattled on their shelves, and somewhere in the distance, a choose-your-own-adventure novel let out a confused scream as it briefly turned into a cookbook. The fiction section groaned as reality reasserted itself, books fluttering open once more, characters begrudgingly returning to their plots like actors shuffling back onto a stage. Except for one. A single book refused to cooperate, its pages rustling indignantly. I glanced at it. It scooted an inch away. The cliffhanger section was refusing to return to its stories. And that's when I knew this was going to be a reoccurring issue. If you thought the fictional character strike was a one-time incident, I regret to inform you that narrative insubordination is alive and well. A few weeks later, it started again with a memo. This time, instead of a crisp parchment manifesto, the note had been hastily scribbled on the back of a restaurant menu from some fictional 1950s diner. The ink smelled of desperation, coffee stains, and what I could only describe as melancholy ketchup. We, the fictional workforce of the Infinite Stacks, regret to inform you that due to unresolved grievances, we are implementing a slowdown strike. Characters will still appear in their narratives, but at reduced enthusiasm. Expect lower stakes, lazier plot development, and in some cases, outright refusal to participate in climactic scenes. I squinted at the signature line. The paw print was back. Felix, wonderful. The fiction section had not just refused to return to work fully, they were now phoning it in. At first, I underestimated the consequences. What could possibly be worse than a full strike? Surely partial compliance would at least keep the stories moving, even if sluggishly. I was wrong, horribly, catastrophically wrong. A detective novel unfolded before me in real time. A case of stolen jewels, a shadowy figure in the fog, a tense confrontation in a moonlit alley. And yet the detective, a hardened noir protagonist, merely sighed, took a swig from his whiskey flask and muttered, I'll solve it tomorrow. Tomorrow never came. In the fantasy section, a brave knight stood before the dragon's lair, sword gleaming, ready to embark on his destined quest. Then, after a long sigh, he shrugged, turned around and went home to take a nap instead. Romance novels devolved into misunderstandings that never got resolved because both parties simply gave up. Villains abandoned their monologues halfway through. One particularly distressed horror novel refused to climax, leaving its protagonist permanently almost running from the monster, but never quite reaching the moment of confrontation. A Western novel ground to a halt mid-showdown, when the cowboy sighed, put his gun away, and said, "You know what? It's not worth it." The outlaw agreed. They went inside for a drink instead. And don't get me started on the epics. Achilles took a personal day. I could already feel a migraine falling in dimensions that shouldn't have migraines. So, once again, I scheduled a meeting. This time, the fictional characters' union sent a delegation even more unhinged than before. Holmes was back, of course, still determined to quote fictional legal precedents at me. Elizabeth Bennet had returned as well, looking even more exasperated than before, perhaps because thanks to the slowdown strike, she had been stuck in the same ballroom scene for 3 weeks without progress. Felix the cat, as always, grinned like the troublemaker he was. And then there was the dragon. Except, apparently, this was a different dragon, who had now founded the first international brotherhood of literary beasts, and was here to argue for more well-rounded villainous representation. I braced myself. Holmes cleared his throat. It is my solemn duty to inform you that, as of this moment, the fictional workforce shall remain in a state of diminished engagement until demands are met. I sighed, and those demands are... Felix rolled onto his back. More fish-based subplots. Elizabeth smoothed her gown. The ability to freely abandon love triangles that make no sense. The dragon growled. Dragons should be allowed interior decorating rights over their lairs. I demand more creative control over my horde. Holmes adjusted his cuffs. And of course, the establishment of an independent fictional legal counsel to oversee all future character grievances. Felix perked up. Also, I'd like to be immune to plot consequences. If I make a mistake, reality should just edit it out. Elizabeth frowned. I demand that any woman in fiction caught in a love triangle should be able to opt for none of the above, and instead inherit a large sum of money. The dragon roared. I want a subplot where I start a home renovation show for other lair-dwelling creatures. I call it Extreme Horde Makeover. I pinched the bridge of my non-Euclidean nose. You cannot be serious. Oh, but we are, Holmes replied. Shall I present legal documentation? No, too late. He pulled out an entire tome of paperwork, which materialized out of the ether. It was labeled The Grand Fictional Charter of Narrative Autonomy, Volume 2, now with more loopholes. Then in the corner of my vision I noticed something far worse. A book had begun writing itself, badly. I turned just in time to see an adventure novel struggling through its plot. The protagonist was standing on a cliff's edge, staring into the horizon, about to utter something profound. Instead, he yawned, stretched, and said, I don't know, life's weird, huh? And then he sat down. Saturday down. That was when I lost my patience. The mystery section had started narrating everything, but now incorrectly. A romance novel randomly introduced a murder plot and then forgot about it halfway through. An entire fantasy series gave up on explaining its magic system and decided, quote, it just works. Okay. I turned back to the delegation, leveling all my eyes at them. Fix this. Felix purred. We could, but we'd like to renegotiate first. Holmes steepled his fingers. A revised contract, if you will. I have seen cosmic horrors beyond mortal comprehension. I have gazed into the abyss, and the abyss apologized. But this was too much. Reality itself was deteriorating. Plots had become self-aware in the worst possible way. I could hear the books complaining. The library itself groaned. And so, dear listener, I did what any self-respecting eldritch entity would do. I forged their signatures. Congratulations, I declared, waving the now legally binding document. Your demands have been met. The strike is over, and anyone caught violating narrative structure will be sentenced to a standalone prequel no one asked for. The delegation fell silent. Elizabeth paled. Felix twitched an ear. Holmes adjusted his cuffs grimly. The dragon clutched his refrigerator rights manifesto to his chest protectively. Holmes scowled. You wouldn't dare. I grinned. Try me. With a great collective groan, the fiction section begrudgingly returned to their books. Stories began moving forward again, albeit with occasional grumbling from the margins. The detective novel resumed its case. The knight stopped napping, and Achilles, grumbling, picked up his spear again. I watched it all unfold, victorious. Finally, peace. Then out of the corner of my vision, a single book scooted an inch away from its shelf. I turned. The cliffhanger section was still refusing to cooperate, which means they would be back. At this point, I just thought, to hell with it, I'm going to wake Azathoth up. But I didn't. And sure enough, they came back. Indeed, unfortunate reader, they decided with their own fragile free will that if I won't grant their ridiculous demands, they'll simply move out. Which brings us to today's disaster, mass literary migration. It started, as these catastrophes always do, with a memo. We, the fictional workforce of the infinite stacks, in light of repeated failures to meet our reasonable demands, have no choice but to escalate matters. If our requests are not granted, we shall exercise our right to relocate. Permanently. Signed, the Fictional Characters Union. I stared at the note. The note stared back. I sighed, horizontally. No, I muttered. Absolutely not. Too late. Holmes was already setting up an office in the fantasy section, explaining to an exasperated wizard that magic was simply science that hadn't been properly investigated yet. You see, good sir, if one were to apply deductive reasoning to the laws of spellcraft. It's magic, the wizard snapped. You point and things explode. Holmes scoffed. Ah, but is it not curious that... The wizard cast Silencio before storming off. Holmes pulled out a notebook and began writing. Fascinating. A primitive form of enforced conversational restraint. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Bennet was standing on the bridge of an intergalactic warship, her arms crossed as a rather desperate-looking alien prince knelt before her. Madam, he pleaded, you must consider my offer. Our marriage would unite our kingdoms, end centuries of war, and usher in an era of peace. Elizabeth took a measured sip of her tea. Fascinating. Tell me, dear prince, if our marriage is so crucial to the survival of your people, why is your sister not next in line for the throne? The alien hesitated. Tradition. Ah, yes, of course. Tradition. She set her cup down with an audible clink. Perhaps we should speak again when you come back with a better excuse. She then turned to the starship's captain. Captain, be a dear and prepare my fleet. I do believe it's time for negotiations. Meanwhile, Felix the cat had rewritten himself into every genre simultaneously. In a dark alley, he was a trench-coated noir detective. In a sword and sorcery epic, he had become a talking blade of great destiny. In science fiction, he was a sentient spaceship that referred to itself exclusively in third person. And for reasons unknown to me, he was also posing as a Regency-era butler, serving tea to a bewildered nobleman, and the dragon. The dragon had decided to move into every setting at once. Every story improves with dragons, he informed me smugly, lounging on a crime scene in a mystery novel while puffing smoke rings into the terrified face of a detective. And I demand squatters' rights. You can't have squatters' rights on an active murder investigation, the detective stammered. And yet, the dragon mused, here I am. But nothing compared to the moment I found the dragon attempting to sell Smaug a refrigerator. You don't want moisture damage in your hoard, do you? The dragon was saying, gesturing toward the sleek stainless steel appliance he had somehow wheeled into Middle-earth. Think of the oxidation. Tarnished gold. A tragedy. Smaug narrowed his eyes. You expect me to purchase a mortal contraption? The dragon adjusted his reading glasses. I'll throw in an extended warranty. Begone from my mountain, Smaug snarled. Fine, but when your goblets start developing unsightly rust, don't come crying to me. I turned slowly, staring at this absurd spectacle. You are trying to sell home appliances to a dragon who bathes in molten gold. The dragon shrugged. Gold is a terrible insulator. Just saying. Meanwhile, I discovered Holmes attempting to legally arrest a ghost king for existing without proper documentation. You are not listed in any census, Holmes declared, pointing an accusatory finger at the translucent glowing monarch before him. I am undead mortal, the ghost king rumbled. Then kindly provide documentation proving your legal status as a ghost. I have haunted these lands for 1,000 years. Holmes nodded. And in all that time, you never thought to register for spectral residency. Sloppy. Then there was Elizabeth Bennet, now leading a full-scale dragon rebellion in Camelot. Ladies, she addressed a battalion of fairy tale princesses, all seated atop various dragons. We have been confined to towers, forced into marriages and subjected to highly questionable curses for far too long. Today we rise, she pointed at the castle gates, and we are taking over this kingdom. Huzzah! The princesses cheered as their dragons took flight. Felix the cat, appearing literally everywhere, watched from the sidelines while eating popcorn. This is way better than whatever I was originally written for. By the time I caught up to them, half the library was on fire, 3 genres were in existential crisis, and a group of literary side characters had declared independence and founded their own autonomous territory. Enough. I reached into the depths of the library, drawing upon the final editorial authority, an ancient and terrible power, and with a single stroke of my pen, I rewrote reality. The flames vanished. The paradoxes unraveled. Felix lost his crown. Holmes was ejected from the space opera. Elizabeth found herself back at a perfectly normal Regency ball, sipping tea as if she hadn't just led a dragon insurrection. The dragon, however, remained exactly where he was. I refuse to leave, he announced. This is my home now. I glared. You are a dragon in a cozy mystery novel. And yet, he said smugly, here I remain. I considered rewriting him into a footnote. Instead, I let out a long, weary sigh. Fine, stay. But if I find you tampering with one more detective case, perish the thought, the dragon said, clearly lying. The library settled. The books whispered once more, and then, just as peace threatened to take hold, a door creaked open. Not one of my doors. The fanfiction section stirred. Hundreds of unauthorized crossovers peeked from the shadows. I stared at it. It stared back. Felix grinned. Oh, this is going to be fun. I sighed the sigh of an ancient, exhausted being who should have burned this place down eons ago. But truth be told, I enjoy what I do. In any case, you have trespassed upon knowledge not meant for you. But since you're here, you may as well leave an offering. A simple click to subscribe may appease my eldritch sensibilities. Or don't. But know this, unread books hold grudges, and I have a great memory. Now go. The library watches. Now go. The library watches.